do anything with this?
Can you try to speak and try to list it from it? It's already live today.
Okay.
Can you say anything?
Bismillah.
Hmm. It's the phone is like from the camera. It's not from the microphone.
You try switching to the other mic, the boom.
Do you want to put the boom mic on there?
Oh, the big one.
Yeah. Is it live right now?
Sorry.
Is it live?
It's live right now.
Okay.
You want to end it?
No, no. Why don't we just do it and then you can try to mess around with the mic.
Okay. It's
Yeah.
still like we can still hear, just like not as loud as.
I'll try to talk louder.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you want to get the boom mic. Yeah. Okay. Bismillah. Bismillah walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we're going to just pick up right from hadith number 15, but we're going to move into the second category that the hadith was speaking about more broadly. Can somebody read the hadith? We're looking at hadith 15. Yeah, go ahead.
Let him who believes in Allah and the last day speak good or keep silence, and let him who believes in Allah and the last day be generous to his neighbor, and let him who believes in Allah and the last day be generous to his guest.
Great, Zafar. Can someone read the Arabic? Hadith number 15. Should I just read it? Yeah. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم جاره ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم ضيفه. رواه البخاري. And so we spent probably like 4 or 5 weeks looking at the first part of this hadith. من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت. That whosoever is habitually believing in Allah in the last day, let them utter good or keep silent. Right? People remember. And so the framing of this is within theological principles. من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر, but it's speaking also about etiquette. So the idea is that our kind of character is also influenced by what it is that we have belief in and conviction in. You see what I mean? And it's giving also an indication of what will constitute a variable that one needs to have complete iman. May Allah make us from the strongest of believers. من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت. That whosoever believes in Allah on the last day, let them speak good or be silent, right? Let them honor their neighbor, let them honor the guest. And so we're going to look at now, kind of moving into the second part, the category that speaks about the neighbor, or in Arabic, the word is jar. So people can open the 4th chapter of the Quran. It's 36th verse. So this is Surah Nisa. We're going to look at verse 36, where we want to look at like some of what the Quran says as well as the Hadith says about neighbors in particular, and then get to a place where we have a working definition of what a neighbor is, because it's not just rooted in the idea of I want to be good just for the sake of goodness, right? Or I'm treating someone well for the sake of treating someone well, but the hadith is telling us that it's rooted in prisms of iman. So these are things that have theological implications. The absence or presence of these things are giving us an indication into like the state of our faith. It's not necessarily that I just know the things that I don't know somehow, but now when one starts to know something, we get to a place where we seek to actualize it in some place. Does anybody have the verse in front of them, 436? You read the English, the Arabic. Go ahead. Either of you.
You shall worship God alone. Do not associate anything with him. You shall regard the parents, the relatives, the orphans, the poor, the related neighbor, the unrelated neighbor, the close associate, the traveling alien, and your servants. God does not like the arrogant shoulders.
Somebody read the Arabic. Go ahead.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم واعبدوا الله ولتشركوا به شيئا وبالولد وبالولدين إحسانا وبذي القربى واليتامى والمساكين والجار ذي القربى وجار الجنوب والصاحب بالجنب وابن السبيل وما ملكت أيمانهم إن الله لا يحب من كان مختالا فخورا.
So this verse is giving kind of the foundational relationship that we have with the divine, right? Wa'budullah, like be an abd of Allah, do you know? And so our religion posits you're going to fundamentally be an abd of something, like your subservience, you want to choose to be one that's in submission to the divine. And it also posits that everyone is essentially going to be an abd, because you're an abd because you rely on something to exist. Allah is uniquely a Rabb because He's Ghani. He doesn't rely on anything to exist. He's self-sufficient. وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ, that you don't want to associate with Him shay'a, anything. But now it's going to give us a list of individuals that we want to have ihsan towards. Right? And if you remember when we looked at the second hadith in this collection, the Hadith Jibra'il, where the angel Gabriel comes, teaches the Prophet about foundational dimensions of religion. أخبرني عن الإسلام, أخبرني عن الإيمان, أخبرني عن الإحسان. That, you know, tell me what is Islam, what is Iman, what is Ihsan. And he says, when he says, what is Ihsan? Does anybody remember what he says? What is Ihsan? We did this like a year plus ago, hadith number 2. Yeah.
I wasn't here, but I'm pretty sure he says that you have to worship God as if you see him.
Yeah. أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه, that you worship Allah as if you see Him. فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك, that although you cannot see Him, He sees you. But you want to see how language is important, right? In a tradition like ours, and here, wa'budullah, like worship Allah. And when the Prophet is having ihsan defined to him, he says, an ta'budullah, that you worship Allah. Do you see? And now the word ihsan that was being defined in that second hadith, this verse of the Quran is telling us to have that type of interaction with these groups of people. بِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ, that you want to have this with people outside. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ, it first says, with your parents, and then with close relatives, with orphans, with the poor. And then he gives 2 categories of neighbors, right? وَالْجَارِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْجَارِ بِالْجُنُبِ, that you want to do this with your neighbors who are close and your neighbors who are distant. And this is in terms of like proximity in the most literal of sense. My next door neighbor and my neighbor that's a little bit far away. In our tradition, a neighbor is considered 40 homes in every direction. So 40 to the right, 40 to the left, 40 in front, 40 behind. And the word jar is not limited only to kind of residential understandings. But as we get into this, you want to think about it more broadly speaking, because there's so much that goes into like who you share space with, right? I could have a neighbor at work. I could have somebody who's neighboring me in my prayer. Why do we have hadith that tell us not to like come with stinky breath to prayer? Do you know what I mean? Right? Because the person next to you is going to be smelling your breath, you know? Why do you put on like a lot of perfume and itr, alhamdulillah? Like why? When you're coming to pray, the person next to you is going to smell good stuff. Do you see? Right? But when we're looking at it, even from the standpoint of just the person who's next door to us, the person who's across the street from us, the person who lives behind us, the person who's also on the other side of us next door to us. In this verse, where Allah is saying you want to have ihsan towards these categories of people, your parents, your closest of relatives, you want to have it towards orphans and the poor. Like, these are not people that we would undermine in any capacity the logic of trying to do right by. Do you get what I mean? Right? Having ihsan towards. And then Allah includes neighbors in that list too. And the neighbors are not being identified by any quality other than like their proximity to you. So it's not just your Muslim neighbors, it's not just your neighbors who have the same race or same ethnicity, it's not just people who share like salient characteristics with you, sociological or otherwise. It's just saying neighbors. And there's two ways we want to think about this. We want to think about not doing wrong as well as doing right, because they're two different groupings of actions, like avoiding what is wrong and doing what is right. This verse is one of them that gives us this indication that it's like straight from Quran. You know, it's an evidence, it's a basis to it. There's other hadith that we want to be able to look at. So the Prophet ﷺ, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu an, he says that the Prophet ﷺ says, if you hear your neighbors say you have done well, then you have done well. If you hear your neighbors say you have done evil, then you have done evil. That the Prophet, he says, he will not enter paradise whose neighbor is not secure from his harm. In another hadith, he is not a believer whose neighbor is not safe from his malevolence. One of the hadith that we've looked at that adds a different wording, none of you will have faith until he loves for his brother or his neighbor what he loves for himself. There's numerous companions who narrate this particular hadith, that Ibn Umar radiallahu anh, he narrates, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh narrates that Jibreel did not stop instructing me to treat neighbors well until I thought he would make them my heirs, right? So there's a companion by the name of Jabir ibn Abdullah who sees the Prophet speaking to someone for a long duration of time. You know, so you could get to a place where, say, you're really good friends with Rahim, and you see that Haris is talking to him for like just a long time, and he doesn't know how to get out of the conversation, you know? And the Prophet ﷺ is known as being somebody who doesn't push people away. And so Jabir sees the Prophet talking to this individual for a long period of time, and he now eventually starts to move forward to have the Prophet have someone like pull him out of the conversation. And before he gets to him, the person the Prophet was talking to steps away. And the Prophet ﷺ tells Jabir that this was Jibreel. And he just kept talking to me about treating your neighbor well until I thought he was going to tell me that the neighbor would inherit from you. You see? Inheritance is like a big deal in our religion. The way your zakat is haram money for you to consume. Do you know? That's money owed to somebody else. That's why you got to know your rules of zakah and whether you're actually obligated to pay it or not, because that money belongs to someone else. Do you get what I mean? When you pass away, there's rules of inheritance that are attached to formulas based off of people who are classified as inheritors from you. Anything you give away before you pass, that's your business. You could empty out everything before you pass away if you wanted to, do you know? Or you can gift things to people before you give away. But if I pass away, you pass away, may Allah enable us to leave this world in a state that's pleasing to Him. When we pass away, our estates are now in a place where 2/3 of the estate is automatically meant to be given to a set formula of inheritors based off of relations that we have and how many of those maintain themselves in terms of they have survived past our transition into the next world. Does that make sense? Right? 1/3 of your wealth you can give and bequeath in like a little bit kind of with your own determinations, but 2/3 are going to go to inheritors. And these are like, you know, your kids, siblings, spouse, etc. And the Prophet is saying, I thought Jibrail was going to just keep telling me to treat these people so well that they would even benefit from what it was that I left behind after I die. Do you see what I mean? Right? Like it had a lot of emphasis to it, the role of the neighbor. Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha says that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, he is not a believer who spends the night satiated while the neighbor to his side is hungry. In another hadith, the believer is one who is trusted by people. The Muslim is one from whose tongue and hand Muslims are safe. The immigrant is one who immigrates away from evil. By the one in whose hand is my soul, a servant will not enter paradise if his neighbor is not secure from his evil. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, what do you say about zina or adultery? And they said, Allah and His Messenger have forbidden it, so it is forbidden until the day of resurrection. The Prophet said, for a man to commit adultery with 10 women is less against him than committing adultery with the wife of his neighbor. What do you say about theft? They said, Allah and His Messenger have forbidden it, so it is forbidden. The Prophet said, for a man to steal from 10 houses is less against him than stealing from his neighbor. And this is an interesting hadith that also talks about neighbors, but kind of from a different standpoint. That the Prophet says, Allah will announce on the day of resurrection, where are my neighbors? Where are my neighbors? And the angels will say, our Lord, who is befitting to be your neighbor? And Allah will say, where are those who filled the masjids? Right? Hassan al-Basri, rahimahullah, he said, O son of Adam, how can you be a believer while your neighbor is not secure from you? O son of Adam, how can you be a Muslim while people are not safe from you? O son of Adam, you will never achieve the reality of faith in your heart until you do not fault people for the same fault that is in yourself. Begin by correcting your own faults. If you do so, you will correct a fault only to find another. I wanted to share one more. A man said, O Messenger of Allah, a woman prays in the night, fasts in the day, does many deeds and gives charity, yet she harms her neighbors with her tongue. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, La khayra fiha hiya min ahl an-nar, that there's no good in her, she is amongst the people of Jahannam. The man said, O Messenger of Allah, another woman prays the obligatory prayers and gives bits of food and charity, yet she does not harm anyone. The Prophet said, she is amongst the people of Jannah. Hiya min ahl al-Jannah, right? It all just goes back to neighbors. Do you get what I mean? And in like 15 minutes, I just shared with you different narrations of hadith and Quran that all of them are just talking about neighbors, 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 neighbors. Do you know what I mean? Not any one of them is specifying the neighbor's religion, race, class. And there's hadith that mention the neighbor that then do specifically mention like how you treat other Muslims and how you treat other people, do you know? But here, foundationally, It's being linked to our state of iman. May Allah make us from the strongest of the mu'mineen. And it's a sunnah that's forgotten from people. Do you know? That the people who live around you, they also are impacted by what you do. You want to think about this as the way it kind of manifests. We have like a life right now that we're existing in this space. It's a private space, but it's public. Do you get what I mean? Most of you are not going to turn to the person next to you and just start yelling in their face, right? Do you know what I mean? It's public, it's a little bit different. At the other end of it, there's kind of a bookend that's not public, but it's secret. It's just me and Allah. No one else is with me. That's just me and God, individually, no one else. In the middle, there's a bucket that is private. That's like me in my house, you know? Like how I sit with you is probably not the same as how I'm hanging out with my kids when we're at home. You know, the people that I share space with. And there's a sense of theological implication, iman, that when I'm now in this setting that has familiarity, there's still people around me who are going to be impacted by the way I carry myself. Do you get what I mean? Because it's not just, hey, I go and I knock on my neighbor's door and I throw like an egg in his face or something like that. But my neighbor hears me yelling at my children. Do you know? My neighbor hears like the loud noise that I have. Do you get what I mean? Right? And it's not like to be humorous, but think about how many people hate living next to masjids in many parts of the country because nobody is mindful of like where they park their cars and they're sticking them in front of people's homes or like in front of their driveways, right? These are literally like neighbors of you in this moment. Do you see? And the hadith is not telling us just to avoid what's good, but it's saying do ikram of the neighbor, right? Like you treat your neighbor with a certain air of generosity. Abu Hanifa, rahmallah, who is the namesake and founder of one of the four major Sunni schools of thought, right? The Hanafi school. He was known to be somebody who prayed like tahajjud, qiyamul layl, like he prayed in the nights, right? He had a neighbor who was an avid alcoholic. And the neighbor, when he would drink alcohol and become drunk, in his drunken state, he would just start singing really loudly late at night. And of the things he would sing at night, he would sing that the people have neglected me, they have forgotten me, they have left me behind. This is what the neighbor is saying when he's drunk. That neighbor gets to a place where he one day gets arrested and he's taken into jail. And then there's a bond that he needs to be bailed out of jail. Abu Hanifa does not hear the drunken song at night. And when he inquires and finds that his neighbor was taken to jail, he goes and people know him. He's Abu Hanifa. And he inquires as to what takes place. He's told this is the price to bail this man out. He pays the bail. The man comes out, and Abu Huraira is now in front of him. Guy doesn't know what to do. And he says that, did I neglect you? Like, have I overlooked you? And the drunken man says, like, no, you're the only one that did not. And he says, I want to follow what it is that you follow. Do you see? And all he was doing was honoring the right of his neighbor. Do you get what I mean? He's not treating him a certain way because of who he is. He's treating him a certain way because of what he aspires to become. He's living like the verse. He's living the hadith, right? And ta'budullaha ka'annaka tarah. And then the verse in Surah Nisa, what is it saying? Like, do ihsan to your neighbors, close and far. That's his neighbor. Who else is going to go look after him and have his back? Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Okay, so let's do this for a couple minutes. More people have trickled in. If you can turn the person next to you, share some names, and what's coming up for you so far as we're talking about the rights of neighbors, right? This part of the hadith is telling us to do ikram of the neighbor. We'll talk about it a little bit more detail, but rather than me just kind of spitting words at you, you can talk to each other for a bit and we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead.
Did you ask a specific question?
Just like what's coming up for you so far.
Oh, right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, nah, I don't even think because like sometimes when I'll read Quran, I'll get a verse like that, and like they'll talk about the word neighbor or whatnot, and they would mean absolutely nothing to me. Because like for me, right, my neighbor, like okay, well, you know, I got one neighbor next door, and the other couple neighbor next door. And it's like, that's how, especially in New York City, you do not touch it. I think that everyone is like established by you do not talk to your people, and it's for the keep the peace. Right. I think like the only times where like I wouldn't talk to my neighbors, I think the same when we had a flood. Because then people started like, you know, like people walked outside and they saw like the blood in the street or whatever. And they were like, oh, like, you know, I was like, oh, nah, it's fucking whatever. And like, you know, everyone just like collectively just like New York bond. It's just like, you know, so that's why it's not like it's really weird because this contrasts to I'm gonna give you another society. My dad, like he lives back home in Montenegro. Like that type of neighbor is completely different. Literally, like, so where I come from, I come from a specific village like off the mountain, and like there's my dad's house like right here, and like this is like the slope of the cliff. There's like the cliff like kind of like the hill goes like this, and then there's like another family that lives here. Okay, these two like that family is not related to me at all by blood. However, as a neighbor, they're closer to me familiar bond because they live with my they live with my dad like you know generations. So it's kind of weird where it's like you know especially I know everyone in that household very well. Whatever I've been to their wedding, it's just you know whatever. But like but like you know it goes to show it's a contrast to society, right? Over there, and also like you know that was back then like my dad's era because you know things change with it. But over there traditionally, right, your neighbor is a big deal because then basically you're like even if you came from two completely different families and you're not related by blood, you end up in being related by blood. And also things get even more complicated because like you know I know my mom's side, my mom comes from like a specific village where it's only people from her bloodline, right? Because the families was African. So that's why, like, you know, it's like a lot of those like societal hierarchies, like, you know, are different. You know, whether you're in Montenegro, Albania, you know, I'm sure like if you go to Arabia, they got something more like that. That's why it's like, you know, it's definitely like there's a lot of like I guess unsettled, like depending on where you are.
Yes, for me, it's just been makes me just self-reflect now. Because at first, when you brought up the example of how like at first I thought it just meant like before you leave from like where you live. Realistically, it's like anywhere you go,
Yeah.
it's really, and so it just makes me think about like I mean how many people do we come across who are less fortunate on the earth, and we choose to some of us choose to walk past them, knowing that we can help them, but you're not helping. In that moment, you are I guess when I hear
Okay, so what are some of the things we're talking about? What's coming up for people so far? What do we discuss? Yeah.
We discussed how it's pretty hard to apply you're talking about in our city because everyone here is closed off. How are we gonna be good to our neighbors in the sense of being welcoming or being engaging? So that was one.
Yeah, it's tough, right? You live in a city that's very kind of individualized and transient and selfish at times. It doesn't mean it's impossible, do you know? What else? What else did we discuss?
Just the broader sense of neighbors. Just anybody that's in close proximity to you, especially riding the train, that essentially we're neighbors with them. You mentioned coworkers as well, and having to be more mindful of how we're showing up. I mentioned a little anecdotal story of how I was a really bad neighbor as a kid, and I used to roller skate in an apartment, but my neighbors never said anything to me because I was a kid. But being more mindful of that as an adult and just the noise, and not even just noise, but like the energy I'm bringing into spaces and being mindful and just self-aware.
Other thoughts? Yeah. Somebody was saying something? No? Am I just hearing things? Sorry. I'm getting old.
I mean, going back to like how like in New York City, it's like very like individualized and like divided. I basically compared that where it's like New York City versus like to where I'm from in like Montenegro and Albania, and I'm sure like this is like apparent if you go to other places like in Arabia or Pakistan, where it's like literally in my case where it's like I haven't like my dad when he grew up, he has a neighbor, and those neighbors are a completely different family or completely different bloodline, but those people are closer to me than some of the people that I'm even related to, just because of the society that we live in, right? And a lot of it end up being generational, right? People end up marrying into each other and whatnot, and also you end up living with one another, right? So it's like literally like I remember one time I was like back home for the summer. My dad wanted to get a car. He literally just like strolled into their house like it's his own, and like he just asked like, oh, do you guys have extra car keys? Yes, okay, thank you. And then we just took the car and we went out to the city, right? So that's why it's like that, just like those concepts where it's like you have like a lot of those like a lot of that contrast where it's like in like in other spaces, right, and in other countries versus like over here where it's like very divided, individualized, compartmentalized aspect where it's kind of like oh, I live in my house, is everyone good? Good, okay, that's it, bye, thank you, like just close the door, don't bother me, that's it.
Sure. And now if we take this anecdote, right? Is that who you picture in your head when you think of someone who's like a strong mu'min? Do you get what I mean? And it's not to make it either or, it could be both and. But when we're thinking about like, hey, who's like a actual strong like believer in Allah? Do you get what I'm saying? And our minds are going to take us to like, I've seen this guy pray this much. I've seen this guy like read this much. They recite this much, do you know? Versus I got a neighbor who honors the rights of neighbors, right? And it's straight out of like foundational hadith. Do you see? And it's not a joke, right? When you look at these things all together, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, I thought Jibreel was going to keep telling me to treat them well until they could inherit from me. So the actualization of prophetic practice within different locales and communities that sometimes we don't necessarily think. Like, think about the irony, right? Just objectively. Don't think about it in a way, you don't want like arrogance to rise up, right? May Allah protect us from it. But just think, like, how many houses of Allah are built that don't really treat their neighbors well, right? Like, please stop parking in our store parking lot. Please stop blocking like our parking lot. Please stop blocking our driveways, right? Like the literal house that is supposed to be rooted in reminders of the divine are made up of a sense of, I don't have any responsibility to what's going on around me. Do you know? And you want to get to a place where you can think of religion and theology, not just purely in terms of memorizing creed, but how it's supposed to influence behavior. When someone's teaching me, like, hey, how do I know that I'm actually doing this thing well? Like this Islam thing, if it's going well for me, how do you treat the people around you? Do you know? And how do you not know? And once you do know, how do you then respond in accord? Right? There's a scholar by the name of Abdullah bin al-Mubarak who told like one of his stories in a lot of different settings where he's asleep at the Kaaba and he has a dream in which two angels are talking about 600,000 people who went for Hajj that year. And they said, no one's Hajj is accepted this year. And then the other angel said, because of the Hajj of one person, everyone's Hajj is going to be accepted. And they give the depiction of a cobbler from Sham who is the reason why everyone's Hajj is accepted, his Hajj. And so Abdullah bin al-Mubarak, he wakes up at the Kaaba and he follows now this description in Sham, seeks to meet this cobbler who's the reason why everyone's Hajj is accepted. People know him by name, but not by face, right? They lived centuries ago. There's not a technology that people necessarily are visually aware, but there's a notoriety still of name and persona. So he doesn't tell anybody that he is Abdullah bin al-Mubarak, this great scholar. When he eventually gets to the cobbler's home, the cobbler takes him in because he's got the rights of a guest. He doesn't even know the guy, right? And this is the next one we're going to talk about like honoring the rights of a guest. He brings him in, and Abdullah bin al-Mubarak says, whenever I start to talk about Hajj, this person changed the topic until he gets to a place where he says, look, I'm Abdullah bin al-Mubarak. I had this dream. Two angels said 600,000 people, no one's Hajj is accepted. But the reason why everyone's Hajj was accepted was your Hajj. And the cobbler says, Sheikh, I don't even know what to tell you. I didn't even go for Hajj this year. Do you know? And he said, I had gathered enough money to make this pilgrimage. And I went to my neighbor's house. And went to my neighbor's house. I found it strange that he wasn't offering me anything to eat or refreshments. And then when it got very late in the day, that he wasn't inviting me to have a meal with them, right? Because it was just normalized. The ikram of your guest, the ikram of your neighbor. Do you know? You can just walk into a house and say, hey, I'm borrowing your car. Like, here's the keys, man, right? It's not strange. That's just what it is. Do you know? And he said, my neighbor said to me, you can't eat in our home because we're so poor. Tonight, my wife is going to cook the carcass of a donkey that I brought home. For you, it's haram to eat, right? It's a dead animal. It's deceased. He said, but for us in our state, it's permissible. And the cobbler said, I went back to my home and I gathered all the money I'd saved for Hajj and I gave it to my neighbor. How could I go on this journey knowing he's in the state that he's in? I was hungry too, but my hunger was voluntary. His was involuntary, you know? Abdullah bin al-Mubarak, he says, this is the reason why your Hajj was the cause of everyone's Hajj being accepted. He didn't even have to go for Hajj, you know? His intention was so pure, but he also brought such barakah from doing right by his neighbor, right? And so when you read these hadith, like you're not a believer if your stomach is satiated while your neighbor is hungry. Do you get what I mean? And it's not even that he was like he didn't know, but then when he found out, he wasn't like, man, you know what? That really sucks for you, but I'm make dua for you in front of the Kaaba, right? Like he had stuff to give to the man, so he gave it to him. It wasn't necessarily an easy decision, but where there's iman in the heart, like you're making decisions through a prism of conviction. Do you get what I mean? And you remember who your teacher is, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So certain things extend generationally that we might attribute to cultural practice, but they're still established as norms rooted in ethics informed by faith principles in our religion. Do you know? And so it's hard in New York City, but like New York City is not our teacher, right? Who is your teacher? Like, what book do you use as a philosophy on life? So it's not just the memorization of it. We just looked at a verse in the 4th chapter of the Quran that says, do ihsan to your neighbors. And it wasn't even like limited. Allah left no room for any type of doubt. The ones that are close to you and the ones that are far away. Do you see? And then it's just getting to a place where I say, well, what do I do in this regard? And how do I do right by them? When we were growing up in New Jersey, I lived in a suburb. And the people who lived next door to us was an older couple named Joe and Helen. And on the other side was a guy named a woman named Stacy. And in front of us was a guy named Matthew, right? And Joe and Helen, like, they took care of everything. Do you know what I mean? There was times when like our fence was damaged and that we'd get up the next day, and Joe, who when I was a kid was probably in his 70s, he had just mended the fence. There were times when my family was not doing so well, like health-wise, and I literally remember driving from New York once to go to my parents' house when it was snowing, so my dad didn't have to shovel the snow, and I got there and the driveway was already shoveled. Do you know? Because they already knew that my dad was old and was ill, and they shoveled it for him. And I went to this old man who lived across the street, and I said, "Thank you for shoveling my parents' driveway." And he said, "That's just what neighbors do." Do you know? But it's not just what neighbors do anymore, right? Do you get what I mean? And we got to be Muslims who revive this sunnah. Do you understand? It doesn't always have to be conscious. Do you know? You can like smack down the waswasa. My neighbor, I don't know how to talk to them or whatever else. Then don't talk to them. Just leave something on their doorstep. You know? You don't interact with them. Just, you know that that person's not doing well. Just give them something without them knowing, right? Or even if they are doing well, like you do something right by them. It doesn't have to be super awkward. Do you know what I mean? Everything's not like, let's just proselytize to the masses, right? I was in Texas and this guy, I was having dinner with him. He's a really nice man. And he was like, "Can I ask you a question?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "I just, moved into this place. This person moved in next to me. Should I invite them over for dinner?" I was like, "Yeah, it's amazing." He's like, "And, should we like give them gifts when it's Eid?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "And should I give him a Quran, when he comes so that he becomes Muslim?" And I was like, "Hey, man, the first time you hang out with this guy, if he gave you a Bible, like, how would you feel?" He'd be like, "I'd be pretty annoyed." And I'm like, "Well, then don't be annoying, right? Like, learn the guy's name." And what happens with Abu Hanifa, his neighbor is experiencing Islam in action. Do you see? Right? The man is drunk, singing, and Abu Hanifa, he's hearing it, not getting agitated, and he goes and he frees the man from jail. Do you know? Anybody could have done it differently. Do you see what I mean? The idea is to be creative in a way that doesn't validate passivity, that lets the nafs rise up. And the nafs is going to tell us to like leave behind the sunnahs. Shaitan, may Allah protect us from him, he's just going to tell us to do haram. So the nafs is what gets in the way. When you got to decide, am I going to pray my sunnah prayers or not? The nafsani thoughts are going to say, don't pray them, they're just sunnahs. The shaitani thoughts are going to be the ones that say, just don't pray at all. Do you know? And so the recommended practices, they're rooted in an element of want, not like compulsion, so that they can cultivate love. Do you see? But at the base of all of it, there's not a sense that there's any place that I go where my behavior somehow is devoid of an understanding consequentially of how it impacts the people around me. Do you get what I mean? I don't want to be the neighbor who I'm not like taking care of my yard and then vermin is getting into the house next door. Hassan al-Basri, rahimahullah, who was a known spiritual master of our tradition, he had a neighbor whose home above his was leaking sewage into his house. And he had like a bag that he would just catch the sewage in. And one day the neighbor came into Hassan al-Basri's home and he saw this thing and he said, "What is this?" And he was like, "This is a bag." And he's like, "But why?" And he said, "It collects sewage." And he says, "Where's the sewage come from?" And eventually he told him, "It's coming from your house." He said, "How long has this been happening?" And he said, "For 20 years. He said, "It's been happening for 20 years and you didn't tell me?" Hassan al-Basri didn't want to make him feel bad. Do you know? Aspirationally, it's not like, it's like it's a goal, right? It wouldn't be a problem to go to your neighbor and say with some adab, like, hey, sewage is leaking from your home into my home. Do you get what I mean? But to give an understanding of how these people weren't just like rhetorically orating hadith, they were living it. They were actually practicing it. Do you get what I mean? Right? To the extent that he's not treating his neighbor just because he wants to be a nice guy. He's treating his neighbor well because Islam tells you to treat your neighbor well. Do you see the difference, right? And it's telling you, Man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir, falyakul khayran aw liyasmut. Whosoever habitually believes in Allah on the last day, let him speak good or be silent. وَمَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ. That whoever is believing Allah on the last day, let him do ikram of his neighbor, and whoever is believing in Allah on the last day, let them be generous and ennoble like their guest. Do you know? The manners in which we could do this proactively are just very subtle, but it requires me to not see myself as the center of everything, and everything then just revolves around me. But being able to embrace an accountability mechanism that understands and acknowledges that what I do can actually impact other people. Do you know? So I'm feeling really down, or I can't sleep, and I live in an apartment that's got thin walls, and I'm blasting this noise. I'm putting on like a lot, you know what I mean? Right? It's like, hey, the person next door to you is trying to sleep too. You get what I'm saying? Right? My kids are little kids. They're innocent. May Allah bless them and protect them. But I gotta tell them, like, we're awake at suhoor time at 5 o'clock in the morning, 4:30 in the morning. You live in an apartment. It doesn't mean everybody is awake at suhoor time. Do you know? Right? And then thinking about that within reason. We're not saying that you leave behind religion. The solution isn't, I have non-Muslim roommates. That means that I just kind of don't have an alarm for Fajr. No, like that's not what we're saying, right? You don't want to take this hadith to validate then behavior that isn't what like our tradition is calling us towards. Do you know? I don't want to make it hard on my coworker, so I'm not going to go to Jummah. No, you go to Jummah, right? Because you go to Jummah. You go pray Dhuhr because you pray Dhuhr. Do you see what I mean? But the mode in which you exist is not in a vacuum. It has consequence on the people around you, right? And there's two different categories, like how it is that I keep them from harm and how it is that I'm doing right by them. Do you see what I mean? We're going to pray Maghrib. It came in like 5 minutes ago. I know Maghrib is going to be in the middle of this halaqah now. Just before maybe we pause for Maghrib, because I don't want to delay people who are coming in only to pray. Like, should we do 6:30 till Maghrib and then take a pause and then come back? Like, is that too long of a time period for everybody? We'll like take a pause for 15 minutes and then resume, or what should we do? Or do we like stop at Maghrib right now?
I like the first idea.
Yeah, I think the first thing.
Okay, so why don't we take a pause right now? We'll call the adhan, we'll pray Maghrib, and then we'll resume in like 10, 12 minutes. So once people are done praying their sunnahs, make dua, we'll come back to discuss this hadith a little bit more, inshallah. Okay. Can one of you guys call the adhan? If you're on the live stream, we're going to come back in like 10 minutes just after we pray. Oh, there's so much happening in this chat box. You can leave the live stream on.
Yeah.
Are you reading it? Yeah, it's a lot.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله
Yeah, don't turn off.
أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
There's one that excited when everybody joins, so they're not kind of blocked out.
الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين لا أقسم بهذا البلد وأنت حل بهذا البلد ووالد وما ولد لقد خلقنا الإنسان في كبد أيحسب أن لن يقدر عليه أحد يقول أهلكت مالا لبدا أيحسب أن لم يره أحد ألم نجعل له عينين ولسانا وشفتين وهديناه النجدين فلا اقتحم العقبة وما أدراك ما العقبة فك رقبة أو إطعام في يوم ذي مسغبة يتيما ذا مقربة أو مسكينا ذا متربة ثم كان من الذين آمنوا وتواصوا بالصبر وتواصوا بالمرحمة أولئك أصحاب الميمنة والذين كفروا بآياتنا هم أصحاب المشأمة عليهم نار مؤصدة. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. القارعة ما القارعة وما أدراك ما القارعة يوم يكون الناس كالفراش المبثوث وتكون الجبال كالعهن المنفوش فأما من ثقلت موازينه فهو في عيشة راضية وأما من خفت موازينه فأمه هاوية وما أدراك ما هي نار هامية. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. We'll resume the halakha in about 5 minutes, inshallah. Since people want to finish praying sunnahs and dua. For those who aren't aware, on Monday nights we do a halakha on the 40 Hadith of Imam Nawawi. We're looking at Hadith number 15 tonight, so feel free to stick around. We'll start again this time. It's not
this week. Yeah, they're not there, but yeah, man. Super shallow, yeah. Nah, no, we only got like 7%. Yeah, you're,
Okay, should we start again? Bismillah, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wasallam. So we were looking at this 15th hadith of the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, rahimahullah. This one we've been looking at for quite some time, and now we're just getting into the latter part of the hadith. We spent a good chunk of time speaking about the first part that says, whosoever believes in Allah on the last day, let him speak good or be silent. Now we're looking at whosoever believes in Allah on the last day, let them do ikram of their neighbor. A couple of other things that come from this is that there are individuals now that we can start to identify that have fundamental rights over us. But you don't want to think about this in kind of the way we think of rights in systems of oppression that we exist in today. Do you know? When you're doing ihsan towards someone, like you want to do that with a sense of intentional compassion and love. To do ikram is like to honor someone, to respect them, to dignify them. You can't do that if you don't even acknowledge their presence. Do you see what I mean? And we'll talk in a little bit about, where we can kind of look at certain hadith that give us insight on, well, what does this look like? But one of the main things that we can also take from a hadith like this is that it's really important where you live and who you live next to. Do you see? And not to just be enthralled by like the neighborhood or the size of the house, but to do your due diligence to think about, well, who are the people around us that we're going to essentially be neighbors of. Because somebody could say, man, like my neighbors are terrible human beings. And that's a reality. I was like, but why did you choose to live near them? Do you know? I don't enjoy like living in the city I live in or the country that I live in. But then why do you fundamentally choose to still stay in these places? And some of us won't have the privilege to be able to get up and move, but some of us are consciously choosing to be in certain places at the detriment then of other things, consequentially. Do you know? I don't like being around people all day that all it is that they talk about is money, right? Then why do you choose to work where you work? And you can say that, what else can I do? But that's the idea. Like you want to reflect on it contemplatively, do you know? So when you're choosing an apartment, when you're choosing like a home, you're choosing where to raise a family, you're choosing how and where to situate yourself. You think about, okay, how does this factor in on the other end of it? That I'm supposed to do right by someone. And what are the criteria that I look at? Abu Hanifa is living next to a man who gets drunk every night. Do you know? But that man, because of Abu Hanifa's kindness towards him, like comes to deen. Do you understand? We sometimes think we've made it because we live in a certain neighborhood or we've acquired a certain amount of wealth. Then we live next to people who fundamentally could care less about us. Do you see? And some of the nicest people are like the people who might not have so much stuff, but where prestige and honor take on variables that are not rooted in our tradition. We then surround ourselves with neighbors who are not in the other direction, like checking in on us too. Does that make sense? Right? So thinking about it at the other end of it, not just what I'm offering, but what am I setting myself up for? Like if I'm sick, how come I'm living next door to somebody who doesn't check in on me? Do you know what I mean? And is that the consequence of like being in a building that is predominantly made up of people who like are racist, who are classist, who have grown up with their own kind of nuffs being what's like the focal point, um, versus like other places in other parts of the world we could walk in and you could just borrow someone's car and they're like, go for it. Do you know what I mean? Right? And what is the thing that enables us to like think about that from a non-materialistic standpoint? Was still in the prism of reality, it might have to exert a little bit more effort. Do you know? Maybe I do have to live like 30 more minutes away from where it is that I go, but is the overall peace of mind that I'm going to get that somebody else next to me is looking after my stuff while I'm gone? Do you know? Could you right now ask the person who lives next door to you to check your mail while you're on vacation? Would they be somebody who would be willing to like look after your family if you had to go away for a few days? Do you know? If you're in a place where you're sick, would they be the first ones to knock on your door, right? And a part of it is determining not after the fact, but within the variables of where it is that I reside. Like, what were the things that I was considering when I was choosing this? And is this one of the things that I'm looking at also? Do you get what I mean? Okay. So there's a couple of things that we want to look at because I'm going to say, well, how do I practically do this? There's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, by Allah, he does not believe. By Allah, he does not believe. By Allah, he does not believe. The one whose neighbor does not feel safe from his evil. Right? And so when the Prophet ﷺ is saying, Wallahi la yu'min, right? That by God, he does not believe. He says this thrice, again and again and again. And now he's juxtaposing it to a neighbor who is not like essentially like safe from you. Do you know? It starts to give us a sense that it's not ambiguity that we explore, but there's hadith that start to define these things for us. So the Prophet is emphasizing Iman again. Yarhamukallah. This is like a theological thing that you want to think about. The state of my Iman can be evidenced through how I engage somebody next to me. And so someone's Iman is in a state where it has potential jeopardy if they are hurting their neighbor willfully, or even if unconsciously, and then you become aware of it. Like, what if the man who came into Hassan al-Basri's home saw the bag of the sewage and was like, I'm just not going to do anything about it. Do you know? Like, I didn't know before, but now I know. And you know what? It's just going to be too much effort. Do you get what I mean? So, not being safe is getting us to a place of what it is because we can understand better what it looks like by knowing what it doesn't look like, right? So, one bucket of doing ikram of your neighbor is that there's a certain sense of security that they have around you. Do you know? They know that this person is going to be an added benefit around my sense of safety in being here. Does that make sense? And so if you're in a place where you'd want to like think it out with reciprocity, egocentricity rooted in entitlement and exceptionalism has me believe that like I should be treated in a certain way, but I don't have to treat someone else in that way. Do you know? Like you're supposed to be doing right by me, even if I'm not doing right by you. So if you want a framework of it, like how would you want someone to be offering this to you? I don't want you to be making like noise when I'm trying to sleep. I don't want you to be like in a place where your garbage is all over the front of my house, right? I'm supposed to be the one that gets to park in this spot. Why do you keep parking in my spot? Do you know? There's another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ tells Abu Dhar radiallahu an that, oh, Abu Dhar, when you're cooking stew, put more water in the broth and take care of your neighbors. Does that make sense? Right? You can imagine how it would feel. Like, you know, we have halakas here and somebody bakes something and we all eat it. Do you get what I mean? Right? Like, it's like not only enjoyable to consume, but it's like, oh, someone thought about us enough that they cooked for us. Do you get what I mean? Why do they do that? Like, nobody's going to be like, I'm turning next to you when we're in this. Khalid said, let's talk to each other. And someone, why are you so annoyed with me? Because you didn't bake a cake today for the halakha. They're like, well, why didn't you bake the cake? Do you know? Right? So the Prophet's telling Abu Dhar, radiallahu an, who's from the Ghafar tribe. And you contextualize this. When Abu Dhar becomes Muslim, nobody wanted anything to do with him when he first came into the city because the Ghafar tribe were known as being people who were kind of just really rough and, you know, had this reputation that Abu Dhar was kind of pushed away. When he converts to Islam, he then goes back to the Ghafar tribe and they see like a whole crowd of people coming in. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he sees them at a distance, he says, Kun Abu Dhar, the be Abu Dhar. And he had brought his whole tribe and they became Muslim, right? But nobody wanted to do anything with him because of the reputation of his tribe. The Prophet's telling him to like cook for other people too. Do you see what I mean? Right? So when you cook a stew, put more water in the broth and take care of your neighbors, right? And like some of us have gone to Medina and Mecca together, do you know? And some of you might be able to think about this. Like this is a Arabian desert area. They're living around Zamzam and water and oases. Do you get what I mean? It's not like so different from where we kind of are situated in apartments. Like you can smell the food from your neighbor's house when you walk in, right? When I get off on our floor in our apartment building, I can smell like whether somebody's like left their trash all over the place or like somebody's cooking something really great. Do you know? And if you've ever been in a place where you can smell something so good from your neighbor's home, you're like, I wish I could eat some of that. That smells delicious. And they knock on the door and they're like, hey, I made some extra just for you. Do you know what I mean? Abu Dhar is not like a delicate, fragile person. People were scared of him when he came into the city. And the Prophet's saying, you be the person that goes, knocks on the door and says, hey, I just baked these cookies. Would you like some too? Do you get what I mean? Right? And this is a society that's rooted in a principle that's called marua. It's like about the most machismo of masculinity. Do you know? Why is Abu Dhar cooking stew to begin with? Because like the men were cooking also, and they were doing this stuff, and he's telling him how to be considerate and thoughtful. Do you know? So there's a lot that goes into these hadith on neighbors about, hey, like you're feeding your stomach, make sure that person's stomach is fed also. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Right? This is another part of it. And isn't it nice, like when somebody like just, like, can you imagine how it would feel? You're sitting and you're like, man, that cake smells great. And then the person knocks and is like, I made one for you too. You're like, who does this? Well, that's the whole idea. Like the mu'mineen are supposed to do this. Like people of Iman. That's who does it. Do you know what I'm saying? There's a hadith where the Prophet says, the best of companions to Allah is the one who is best to his companions, and the best of neighbors to Allah is the one who is best to his neighbors. What does it mean to be like good or the best to someone? Do you know? Not minimally, but aspirationally. Do you see? And the ethic informed by Iman and faith that is in a place that, like, hey, my neighbor's like cat just died. My neighbor's like mother just died. Do you know? Like they're alone and lonely in New York City. Can you imagine you're a neighbor right now of somebody who is afraid to like leave the country because of, ICE agents potentially getting down on them? The pandemic was crazy hard for so many people. Do you know what I mean? How many people got up and just left, do you know? And didn't think about anybody that they were leaving behind. They were able to just go to someplace else. We had during Hurricane Sandy in New York City, like everything south of 34th Street went out in Manhattan. The lights were out. And then Brooklyn and Queens, like lights were out for a while. Do you know? Some of you might remember this. Anybody remember Hurricane Sandy? Lights went out. This building and the building next door were on generators. And this whole room and all the hallways and every room that you've ever been in these buildings were like makeshift cots were put together, and people were just sleeping side by side by side, like throughout both this building and the building next door. And afterwards, like when things started to get some semblance of normalcy, there's an older woman who lived in an apartment building like 2-3 like buildings down. And in Sandy, the lights went out in her apartment, but she was living on a top floor and she was so old, she didn't have the ability to walk down the stairs. Nobody checked in on her. Do you know? And so she lived in the dark in this building for some time. And she got to a point where she opened her front door to just kind of get some ventilation because there's no lights and no electricity. So there's no fans or whatever else. And she then tried to open a window in her kitchen to create a draft. And when she did so, the chair she was on, she stumbled a bit, slipped off of it, flew out the front door, and then the door closed. And now she's in the hallway in the dark. She's an old woman, you see? And she gets to a point where she just can't stand anymore. And then she just sat down, but because she's so old, she didn't have the strength to get back up on her own feet, you know? And hours passed, and she thought she was just gonna die. And she said, thank God, like somebody was just going floor by floor, helped her up, and then took her down the stairs hand in hand. Do you see what I mean? How do you think she went to the bathroom when she was sitting on the ground for all those hours? Do you know? What kind of thoughts do you think were going through her head? And it's not like she lived a farmhouse acres away. Like her door is here and the other person's door is right there. But this is where egocentric, like, I'm good. I got out the building. I'm good. I got out of COVID. I'm good. Like I got to where I got to. Do you know? And the Prophet is saying the best of companions to Allah is the one who's best to his companions, and the best of neighbors to Allah is the one who is best to his neighbors, right? How does an elder woman get to that place where nobody's checking in on her other than everybody's just thinking of themselves, right? That's just what it is. Do you know? Nobody thought to think about this like old lady. Do you get what I mean? So me being good to someone is, I know that they're alone. I know that they're lonely. I know that they're not well. I'm going to check in on them, see how they're doing, like spend some time with them. Do you see? So let's do this just for a quick minute. What are like other things that you think, if one was to start to like define these things so they're not ambiguous, like doing good to someone, doing well to someone, ihsan towards someone, like ikram towards someone, what could that look like fundamentally? And think about it as an individual, right? Like, what does that mean for me in terms of the people that are around me? You think about it for us as a community, you know, we are neighbors of different people. Like, think about it as we endeavor towards the establishment of our own space, right? What does it mean for us to share space with others, like in a locale? Do you get what I mean? But if one was to say to you, like, hey, how do I actually have like a sense of ikram towards my neighbor? How do I like treat them well with dignity and respect? Like, what does that look like? If we could talk about that just for a couple minutes, and we'll come back and discuss. But go ahead.
Since you guys are like this, how was it when you guys were circling around? Okay, because I asked this question because just thinking about it. I never been to Mecca, but I always see like people talking about how it's very high class. Because nobody's like thinking about it like the other person is on the other side. And in my head, I'm thinking about this is supposed to be like the house of Allah. Even in the house of Allah, you would think it would be the best that it gets. But even then, it's not like we're still pushing each
People
other.
go into the
That's the answer to that
It's like, yeah,
question, but I
people
have
have
no
they're
answer.
going to class.
So
So
I'm
you
thinking
don't
that
literally just 24/7. People
I
are
need
just
to
trying
listen
to just
to
it's
the
like
years back to
think of like the
only
worst of people just on top of one another, just
so I
clawing their way trying to get to class. Me, I
and
didn't bother
someone
with
I
that
knew.
because I was like, you know what? I'm
So
here
the
for worship.
realization I had
I'm
was
a go about one.
And I guess that would make
it's like
sense.
I
'Cause
chose
Yeah.
that would be
to
an
live in a
example of
dorm
not
building
honoring.
that's like
Yeah.
safer.
Yeah. Oh,
And I
absolutely.
realized
What?
Like, does that make
what
sense?
happened.
What people going? Yeah. Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Well, I guess
There's one of them.
like
Where I
how
wasn't
do you
even
get to that
I think
point
that was
to
a
have this
different
question?
scene.
I would think
So this person
understanding
basically was a rainstorm, so it was like it was
detaching the
like
heart
this
from
press
the
button
dunya
and things in my store.
understanding
So this
that
person
like,
like
you weren't
wanted to
taking
go
that
to like the doors of my neighbors to try to
the
get
souls are
inside.
eternal, so you were
And all the female neighbors refused to let this guy in.
and in that sense, like,
And they were just like,
once you
what
start to
are you
detach
doing?
yourself
And so
from
like this made up like this person made this story of
things
like
and
daughter, blah blah blah.
and
And
like well,
I just
people are
realized
passive
like
and well, people are
that I'm slightly
so many
emotional.
things don't matter.
After
You start
that day,
realizing that
all of those
if I lose
neighbors
this
who have like
attachment and I start
lived in
realizing
those
now I'm
mountains
able
they
to
just made sure to
even
not let
sensitive
that
or
guy
self-centered.
enter my building. Just cause
Yeah.
them to
Also, I think this is
feel
like a hadith that he says where it's like,
And now it's just like
love for your neighbor, you love yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where it's like, let's say, like, you know,
I
even like,
didn't
I'll
know
say, like, even like a simple thing, right?
I just made that realization.
Great. Cookies. Food, right?
That's big word
I love these cookies so much. I want to eat the whole cookie. Okay, I could eat the whole thing very easily. No one's gonna question it, right? But you know, it's always nice to offer, and even if like someone else gets it, because like, you know, that cookie, like someone else eating the cookies with you, whatever, like you know, it's like this like twice the better for that. That's why it's like you know, you know, it's easy to like just like share that, just like, why not? I could finish a whole box of flies. You give me, you give it to me, bro. I'll clear it. But it's like, you know, it's always where it's like sometimes where it's like, you know, you'll never know where it's like, you know, believe it or not, like, you know, like a one cookie or sweet or something like that, like, you know, it can make a difference, right? It can, and that's what like, you know, it's about like, you know, because especially when I know how I feel when I eat treat snacks and sweets and cookies and stuff like that, like, oh, you know, they're awesome, they're great, you know. But like, you know, then afterwards, I'm like, hey, like, you know, like someone else could feel that too. Right?
I don't know where I heard this from. I think we should have. Somebody was.
Okay, so what are some of the things we're talking about? What's coming up for people as we're starting to kind of distill this for myself? Like somebody asked me, how do I do this thing? What does that look like? What are we discussing? And maybe a segue into that is like, it's not like we said one obscure hadith, you know? We said like dozens of different citations that talk about this thing. And when somebody is talking to you about Islam or teaching you Islam, like why is this not more emphasized in relation to like the other stuff that we talk about too, that we quite often see as forgotten? You're gonna say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like every single story you shared made me think of my friend who is a neighbor of mine. And I kept thinking this sounds exactly like her. And I think reflecting back on something someone else said previously, that we live in a city where, you know, we make assumptions that everything is individualistic. We don't want to bother people. My friend, on the other hand, has like this very pure heart where she doesn't really believe in that sort of individualism. And she just has a completely different mindset. Whereas when I moved into the building, I didn't say hi to my neighbors, and I would just like respectfully create distance because I assumed that's what my neighbors would want. And so she does not believe in that. And so that mindset shift just completely changes her behavior. And within the 2-3 years that we both have lived in this building, we're now in this group chat of like 15 plus women who live in the building, who meet regularly. And it's all because of people like her, where she will start a conversation in the elevator about someone's dog. And that conversation turns into, do you need something? I have this. And as a result, she becomes really good friends. And then it turns into like an actual neighborhood where now we have Taco Tuesdays. Now we have like these regular monthly meetups and stuff. And it's kind of like shying away from the I live in New York City and therefore everyone has their own individualistic lifestyle and they want to be alone, to I don't believe that. I believe in a communal framework, and therefore I do believe that there is something that I can provide to someone and they can provide to me regularly. And now like this group chat's already talking about Palestine and going to some documentary that's out in Angelica Theater and the encampments. And like me and my friend are the only Muslims in this group chat. And these other women have just decided, let's go watch the encampments together. It's like, subhanAllah, like I really think it's just from your story, it's really just having this purity of heart and just assuming good intention with the other person. And assuming that there's something I can provide and they can provide. It's just mutual aid.
Yeah, and that's that of all the great things that you said, right? One of the things that's really important to stick out, it's like goes back to the state of one's heart. Do you get what I mean? Right? Like you're not going to say that this person did this because she owns the building, she's the landlord. Someone was like, hey, describe this lady who talks to these people and brings them together. What is it that's about her? She's got a good heart. Do you know what I mean? Where does Iman exist? It exists in your heart. The Hadith describes it as a light in the heart, right? May Allah give us illuminated hearts. Like, how do you know that it's going well? It's not like a religion that brings you to selfishness. It's a religion that brings you to selflessness. Do you see what I mean? It's transformative. There's all this other like junk in my heart and clutter in my heart and confusion and pain. That's fine. But then sometimes Allah sends us people that are like this to be like, aspirationally, that's the type of person that I would like to be. I'd like to like, or I'd like to be in their company. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Right? What else are we discussing?
Something that you just mentioned that just triggered in my brain, releasing judgment of people. Sometimes we have these preconceived notions of someone when we meet them, so we don't interact with them. But I think part of this would be releasing judgment, but we also talked about greeting people and actively listening and asking them how they are and genuinely being able to hold space for whatever it is that the response might be.
Yeah. And look at like the wisdom of being in a place where you go to reside is a place where you have a sense of consciousness of the people around you, because you go home to rest, right? Like the world outside can be exhausting and tiring, and one can make like a different sense of like justification around isolation, perhaps. I just work here, I don't really like vibe with these people. But you want to vibe with the people that you live with, you want to like be in a place where there's some sense of connectivity to them. Do you see what I mean? Some circumstances can be very different, right? Like I live in an NYU dorm. I'm 42 years old. The guys that live in my building are 19 or 20, but there's all kinds of faculty and staff that live in our building too. We know the names of the guards of our building, right? We know the names of the maintenance crews in our building, right? We like have people that will have come over in different times into our homes. Do you see what I mean? Right? And it extends in these ways. Just fundamentally, it's like if I'm not thinking from my heart, I'm still thinking from someplace. Do I know the names of the people who are cleaning this building and taking out the trash and doing this and doing that? And why or why not, right? And just because nobody else does, I'm not supposed to be like everybody else. I'm Muslim. I'm supposed to be different. Do you see what I mean? I'm not just different because like I bang out some like prostrations every day. The prostrations are supposed to bring me to something transformative. Do you know? And this is why this is not being defined in the prism of Islam. It's being defined in the prism of Iman. Like the one who believes in Allah on the last day, then let them do ikram of their neighbor. Do you see? Does that make sense? Like little things can go a long way. Do you know? That might seem like strange to certain people, but then be strange, right? And if somebody doesn't take you up on it, you don't have to like be unnecessarily abrasive and creepy. No, like I have to feed you, right? No, if they're good, they're good. Like let them be. But just so they know that you're there, because you don't know in what kind of crisis situation something could come up, right? And you think, man, just think, we are in the West Village. I tell you this story about this old woman living down the street who was like really living in apartments in the neighborhood. Do you know? Market rates are what they are, whatever it is that it is. She might have lived there for generations and other people have come and gone. Do you see what I mean? Is it surprising to any one of us that nobody checked in and knocked on her door when they were trying to leave? And the sad reality is that, like, probably none of us is shocked that that was something that actually happened. Do you see? But it's characteristic of kind of what is societally normative. And that's why you got to go against the grain sometimes and say, like, I'm not trying to be like this. Do you know? I want to be a little bit different. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? When you start to then identify in the context of some of what like Haris was saying before, do you know? People have like multiple variables to their identity. If I live next door to somebody and they're my neighbor, they have a right over me, right? What if they're my close relative? Then they have 2 rights over me. Do you get what I mean? What if it's my mom or dad? Then they got 3 rights over me. Do you see what I'm saying? What if the person who lives next door to me is a refugee? What if the person who's next door to me is like miskeen, right? Like I'm in this building and I walk every day as like a communal neighbor of people who sleep in the park or who sleep on the streets. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? Everybody doesn't want us to like pander to them or patronize them, but you can tell when it's done with love versus like it's done with ego. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, do you think this woman in your building who talks to people in the elevator, she's doing it just to like give herself an ego trip? It doesn't sound like it, you know? But then you start to think about kind of a social media culture where everything has to be broadcast to the world. Look, like I gave this piece of food to this homeless person. Let's take a picture of him and show everybody. And then nobody like ever comes and helps this person ever again because it wasn't for them. It was just for like not even me fully, just parts of me that are not in my heart or my heart's best interest. Do you get what I'm saying? That's why the starting point of this is like public, secret, and private. Sometimes it's also okay for me to do right by somebody I share space with without them knowing. Do you know? And the manifestations of these things can be communal. Let's get together and eat together. And sometimes, like, I just have to know the dignity of the person next to me, and I can still leave a plate of food for them without them having to know that I left it for them. But it's a case by case basis. Ethics are situational, and it's not going to be cookie cutter across the board. Sometimes that person is going to feel joy in knowing the face of the person who was with them. And sometimes the person is going to just need a little bit more of a distance, but still in a place where they like get support in some capacity. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Yeah? It does not make sense? It does, right? So you want to sit with this hadith and think about it in the prism, secondly, here, right? Man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir falyakul khayran aw liyasmut. And now the second part, right? Falyukrim jara, right? That you do ikram of the neighbor. The last thing that I want us to just talk about, and then we'll get close to Isha time and maybe we'll pray Isha together and wrap up. What's the connection, if any, between the first part of the hadith and the second part? Whosoever believes in Allah on the last day, let them speak good or be silent. And whosoever believes in Allah and the last day, let them respect their neighbor, right? Dignify their neighbor. Because things that are put together in verses of the Quran or like hadith, they're not like grocery lists, you know? Get spaghetti and get cucumbers and get toilet paper, right? You're not going to make something that has toilet paper, cucumbers, and spaghetti in it. Nobody's going to eat that. These are three things that show up on a list but don't have correlation to each other. Does that make sense? And that's what certain things can be. Like they can be like in the same piece of paper or in the same sentence, but have fundamentally independence from one another, right? But when we look at this verse from Surah An-Nisa that talks about, right, that you worship Allah, and then it's saying, وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, and you're doing ihsan to your parents, and then it's talking about close relatives, and it's talking about orphans, and it's talking about people in need, and neighbors that are close to you and neighbors that are far away. The wow that keeps coming up is a wow grammatically, wow, not wow in English, the letter wow in Arabic, right? The wa sound, right? Wa. It's saying and. It's not saying and like and toilet paper and spaghetti and cucumbers, but it's saying and in the sense that it's connecting these things together. Do you know? How does the idea of speaking good or being silent connect to the idea of like doing ikram of your neighbors? Do you get what the question is? So let's talk about that a little bit so we can see if there's something we can delve into that has an overlap between these two things. And we'll come back and discuss and wrap up for today.
Both of them have to do with character. The way you treat other people. One is the way you speak to other people, the way you interact with other people, especially ones that you live near. And the Prophet tells us that it's only coming to perfect character. right? So that's what Islam is. Islam is about being a good person, right? And that comes from character. So when you go through those two, character and the way you respect and treat other people.
I think just like Khalid was saying, when you're in your home, you're in your most relaxed state.
Don't all rush to like answer at once.
Doing things that like, you probably don't do anywhere else. And so there's a respect for
You don't want everybody speaking over each other, so raise your hand when you're ready.
If you're going to be a good leader, you're not going to go and make fun of them for their unique habits or things that they do, or even gossip about what they're doing, unless it's something that is like abusive or something.
That wouldn't be gospel.
That wouldn't be gossip, but like you are seeing that in probably a more intimate setting than you would see someone at the masjid or at work. So like you probably see a side of them that other people don't see.
Also, too, like making sure when he told the story about the woman that played and donated and did all the things, but she harmed her neighbors with her tongue and her speech. So making sure we're not having poor speech with our neighbors and we're speaking to them respectfully. The aspect of
I guess it covers a lot of your day-to-day
being discreet about what happened in the four walls or in the abode, not sharing your business. But over here, a phone conversation, not then sharing that, like you said, not sharing that information with someone else, like gossip, unless someone is
that covers a lot of the basics.
but that's still not harming them with our tongue.
Your spirit.
Yeah.
Another way could be like if you have an issue with your neighbor. Well, I guess it's just to communicate, but if it's like something that can be solved or like an impasse, just if you don't have anything nice to say, just not saying anything at all could be a way to show it. Even though it's better to, of course, build a connection, but if you feel like you can't, then just gotta stay
So
silent.
we call
Good talking.
I think about when you saying that there was a something that like
A lot of ideas.
keep a pebble on his
Speak loud or be silent.
So that he doesn't say anything wrong.
Yeah, so he doesn't harm people with his tongue.
Is that it? There's nothing.
You know, what I'm thinking about
Oh, it's
how
generous.
the very intricate relationship between landlord and tenant plays out with this
And
particular
also like
thing.
I know something it's not
I
just
just
neighbors,
feel
it's
like
also like your friends,
Landlord,
family.
being a landlord can be a job, and people
No, this
have
comes
it
from
as
the
a
eye.
job, and they are not on
Those
the
talking about like
I mean, there's
friends,
so many,
family,
like a plethora of ways,
more of like the broader.
but when we were talking, I'm like, it'd be interesting to see, I get my personal landlord out here, but it would be interesting to see if they were living in, that they had good character with their tenants, like, I don't think we would be like,
Okay, so what do we think? I feel like these guys are struggling over here on this side. So, yeah.
Struggling now.
Struggling, no? No.
Because all had the same ideas, it was one person.
That was what? Yeah. So what do we think? Is there a connection between these two? Speak good or be silent and kind of honoring the neighbor. Why are these both in the same hadith? Right? Like, why doesn't it say speak good or be silent and treat your mom with respect? Right? Speak good and be silent and go feed the hungry. It could have said anything. Why are these things paired together here? What do we think? Yeah.
So it's, I think the connection between the two is it's the teaching of good character, right? Speaking well to other people and being kind to the people who you're around and who you come across every single day. Because it's not only someone who you just live next to, it can also be your neighbor at your desk at work, right? Like who you work by, who you're constantly interacting with, right? Like these are your neighbors in a sense, right? Because you're constantly seeing them, right? So it's about being kind and having good character with everyone that you interact with. And the Prophet of Islam, he tells us that I have not come except to perfect perfect character, right? So the perfect character and good character and treating people around you well is essentially a pillar of Islam. That's who you are as a Muslim. That was one of the reasons the Prophet of Islam was sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to correct everyone's character and to make everyone better people.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it relates to something you said earlier before about how when you're at home, you're probably in a more relaxed state and you're in a more intimate setting than elsewhere, like such as work, mosque, or some sort of event. And so neighbors probably see an intimate side of the person that they live next to, whether it's based off of things that they own, based off of their behaviors, etc. They might even overhear conversations. So it seems like you should not, tell other people about what you're hearing from your neighbors if the neighbor might not like it. You should protect their dignity and their honor outside of a neighbor setting, and you should just continuously speak well and good to them because they are basically the people you live next to.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah, all of it sounds like it makes sense, right? Who is the prophet saying this to? Like, who's hearing these words when he's saying them? Yeah. Okay, so there's Muslims who believe in Islam. Is there anyone else who's hearing them? Like when Surah Nisa is revealed, who is hearing this verse of the Quran? Huh? The women. Yeah, what are you going to say?
Perhaps some Muslims that were being persecuted by their neighbors.
People being persecuted by their neighbors who are Muslim. Anything else?
Like
Non-Muslim people, right? Like, he's telling people what Islam is. This is a society that they come out of that fundamentally there's no sense of accountability, right? You could say whatever it is that you want to about anybody. If you are in a position of power, like, and the Prophet's saying, no, think twice about how you speak. You could be somebody's neighbor. The Prophet's own neighbors, when he became like the prophet of God, and they started to publicly propagate, there were people who lived near him who were related to him that were treating him like garbage, throwing stones at him and intestines of stuff at him. Do you know what I mean? Contextualizing this within a sense that it wasn't like all la-di-da in where they are, but the refinement of the character, like kind of together in a place that says, what's a starting point for some of us also? One, you got to like control your tongue. Do you know? You get to a place where like the tongue is a deep evidence of what it is that's going on in your heart. So you're in a place where you speak into yourself realities, you like impose certain realities on others. Your tongue is going to be a gateway. Like, and if you are the one that's talking, you can't listen, right? And learning is attached to listening. Do you get what I mean? And all these people who are sitting there, like listening to this stuff, Mecca or Medina, the refinement of etiquette, that's like this religion thing isn't just something that you do once a year or like during certain like special days, but it's supposed to inform certain things. And in relation to it, it's like, hey, not only do you have to be mindful about how you talk, but you got to treat your neighbors well. So if he's speaking to these Muslims and he's speaking to these people who are not Muslims, no qualifications. I got to treat people well, and I can't say anything bad to somebody or be racist or curse at them or abusive to them. But plus, I also have to do right by them. Like, I don't like the guy that lives near me. I don't like that you're preaching Islam. Do you know? That guy did this to me. That guy did that to me. They don't have as much money as I do. What's the point of me having money if I can't hold it over somebody's head? Do you see what I mean? Do you get what I'm saying? Right? And you start to like contextualize. When you're in these close-knit communities that also enable you to walk into someone's house and take some keys because they honor the rights, right? There's also like a lot of like culture where people just get together in houses and they speak terribly about like other people. Do you know? The ones that they share like space with, the neighborhoods and whatever else. Do you get what I mean? But he's refining an etiquette that's contextualized. These were guys that buried their daughters alive. And the prophet's now telling them, like, the neighbor has so much of a right over you, they could probably even inherit from you. No qualification. Muslim, non-Muslim, black, white, brown. You know, speak good or be silent. And you don't have to talk to treat someone well. On top of that, you got to treat these people good. And then the last is going to be like the treating of the guest, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more next week. But think about the audience that he's engaging in over the course of a 23-year period of revelation that is still dealing with the challenges that they're dealing with. The sending of a prophet doesn't come because everything's going amazing. They're sending a book because people kind of went off track. And part of the refinement is what it is that was just said. إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. That I was sent only to perfect ethical conduct. Do you know what I mean? So you like look at text and verses. What does قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدْ mean in the frame of إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ? If I was only sent to perfect ethical conduct, what does Surah Asr mean in relation to this? What does Surah Ikhlas mean? Surah Nas mean in relation to this? Do you get what I'm saying? Right? Does that make sense? And we do, man. We live in like bougie places. Do you know? I went to visit friends for Eid, not this Eid, but a previous Eid. And I got into the apartment building and I still remember, not because it stings, but just because it was so random. I didn't expect it was gonna happen. But a lady who lived in the building wouldn't get in the elevator with me. Do you know? And the guy at the front desk was like pandering to her and was like, "Hey, do you want me to go with you? I'll make sure he doesn't come up." I can hear them. You know what I mean? I'm like, I hear you, dude. Like, what are you talking about? Do you know? But there are a lot of people who don't want to be connected to people who are different from them. Do you know? They don't want to be close to people who are from different races or cultures or social classes. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have space with people who get where you're coming from, but this isn't the religion that tells us to create those kinds of like stratified hierarchies. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Do you know? And so spend some time with this like hadith, because certain things, there's like things we can't do, right? But like we all have neighbors. Do you know what I'm saying? When you get ready to like go to the masjid, you know, you think about like what thoughtfulness means. The prophet is telling you, you know, because we've all been in the masjid, man. Somebody just burps in front, like next to you, and Imam's tarawih prayers, and you're reading long rakahs. Now you're inhaling like all of the stuff that this guy just ate during iftar. You know what I'm saying? It's like, come on, bro. What is this, right? But you deepen in a reflection on the hadith. I'm sharing space with you. Like, I'm not the only one that's going to prostrate on this piece of earth. Like, we're in it together. Do you see what I mean? And it's not to be condescending to somebody who doesn't have capacity that we have in terms of like water and showers and these kinds of things. Do you know? But that much more of a sense, right? Of like, how do you then create a sense of generosity? You know, likely when we're praying in the park, there might be someone who joins us who also is coming like from a shelter, right? So maybe you put like the ither in your pocket and you pass it around to everybody so no one feels singled out. And then everybody gets a little bit to like rub on their hands, including the person who didn't take a shower because they don't have a shower. Do you understand what I'm saying? Right? Does that make sense? And so you just sit with it. Like, how do I do some of this in my own day to day? It's not like I got to go and throw a banquet for somebody. You're just thinking about them, where they're coming from in their existence. Do you get what I mean? Okay. I don't know like how people are feeling right now. Every day to me still feels like tomorrow should be the weekend. I like, Doesn't feel like it's Monday today to me, but it is Monday. I also don't know why there's not so many students in the building because everybody's not Muslim, and it's the first day of class after spring break, but the buildings are all empty, and it doesn't make sense. So unless everyone pretended like they were Muslim and didn't go to class today because they were observing Eid, I didn't go teach my classes today, so I don't know how many people were in my class. My co-teachers taught the class. But we are going to have all of our events and stuff happening throughout the course of the week, like our regular halakas. We're going to resume their schedules. So Dr. Murmur will be having one tomorrow. Dr. Marwa and myself on Wednesday. I think Sheikh Fayaz might be doing one this Thursday as well. We'll get back into kind of the regular flow of our programs that'll happen weekly until essentially like the second to last week of May post-graduation. Then we'll transition into like a summer hour of operations. So just people want to anticipate and share with others. And then other things that come up, we'll kind of let people know. I think this Saturday, we're doing an Eid event for our convert community. And I don't know the exact time of that, but it's on Saturday. You can find it. It's on Sunday. Oh, no, you're right. It's on Sunday. And then they were going to go to the Eid Bazaar after the lunch that is happening at the new space. That's from 12 to 6 on this coming Sunday also. But other stuff you can find on our social media and different things. So why don't we take a pause? If anybody needs to make wudu, we'll call the Iqama for Isha in 5 minutes, inshallah. We'll see everybody next Monday. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
It's a lot of comments.